And let me say that as we're doing this, I really do want to offer an argument that the work that we have been doing and the work that our delegations will be doing on behalf of the church is in fact trying to choose an identity, to choose the values, and to choose the purpose that the church will live with as it moves into the future. And while I'm doing this, I'm going to try to stay in the role that I have been given as a coach to the moderators and as a consultant to your process, to design your time together to make it as productive as possible. So I won't be talking a lot about the issues of human sexuality. And I won't be getting into the content of your conversation, nor will I be going very far into the theology that we've been wrestling with, but rather ask us to pay attention to the process that we have been following, the principles that we have been using, and the larger picture, the context in which a lot of this work has been doing. And so let me start by saying that my argument with the Council of Bishops, and that has been part of ours, is that we have to remember where we are in the conversation and to realize that all of us know that what has prompted the work of the Commission is a contest in the church that is about 50 years old or more, but that the work that we have been doing is about 2 years in process since the last General Conference meeting, and that as a commission we've been meeting for about a year and a third, almost a year and a half. And so we are well into this work, and that what we have been doing is shaping a proposal. Now, what it says here, shaping a proposal, and it is the work of negotiating. I'm using a dictionary definition here of negotiating that talks about obtaining something or bringing something about by discussion. By discussion. We'll come back to this a couple of times. The work that we have been doing, which is the work of teaching each other how to move ahead, but also the work of discernment, is a discussion about, let me tell you what I see so that you can tell me what you see, so that together we might see something different. And we have been negotiating not only among ourselves, but with the Council of Bishops as we tell them what we see and they tell us what they see, and our work has gone ahead. And as we've done that, we've come up with 3 pieces. One is the theological framework and the missional framework. And friends, as someone who sits to the side and thinks about the work that you are doing, I need to say for the future of the church, these are actually the 2 most important parts of the work that you have done. They are simply not the pressing issue. And so we are helping the church deal with the most pressing questions about what are the models that it will allow us to move ahead. But those models are actually in service to our sense of mission and to our understanding, our theological understanding of ourselves. And so I really want to recognize that the work you've been doing is deeper than simply trying to come up with a model that allows the church to move ahead. I want to make the argument, which I did with the Council of Bishops, that this is a very different kind of work, that the report that you sent to them, that the proposal that the special session of General Conference will see, is in fact a very different kind of work. It's a product of a very different kind of work that we have done here. This has not been a typical church meeting. And that it asks for a different response. And if we're able to follow this path, potentially it leads to a different kind of a story and a different kind of a future for the United Methodist Church. So let's talk about the differences. Einstein is to have said, we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used to create them. As I said, this contest over human sexuality has been going on for more than 5 decades. We have tried to address this dilemma within our lives as a community by debating with each other, by taking positions, at times against each other, by passing legislation, by taking our conversations to votes, to caucus together and sometimes against each other. We have even come to the point in our worst moments of disparaging one another in order to solve this issue. I'm simply saying that if that is how we have dealt with the situation for the last 50 years, then we can't expect things to be different unless we approach the work with different assumptions. You can't keep doing the same thing and expect that there will be different results. Now, there's a different way of saying the same thing which is more familiar to us as a community. That within the gospel it says, no one sews a piece of new unshrunk cloth on old clothes, or the part that probably more people will be able to quote more freely is, no one pours new wine into old wineskins. There has to be something different. And you as a commission on a way forward have worked hard to understand not only your task, but to understand yourselves differently in order to try to move this conversation ahead for the church. Fairly said? This is where the group would say yes. Yes. All right. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to begin to talk about what has been different about this commission's work. And we're going to start with a joke that some people have said I should never have told from the very beginning with the Council of Bishops, but I hear that from my family all the time when I tell jokes. So this is an old Garrison Keillor joke from the Prairie Home Companion. And the question is, what did the Queen say when presented with the first Jewish candidate for knighthood? Why is this night different from all other nights? All right, now, this is the reaction I get from my family to this. But it's obviously a play off of the Jewish Passover Seder meal. The very first question of the liturgy that goes with that meal is to be asked by the youngest child, why is this night different from all other nights? Now, think about it. It's meant to be a naive question, and it's meant to be asked by the most naive person in the family. Because it's asking, why is it that something that we are so familiar with suddenly so different? If our family always gets together and we all know each other, and if we commonly have an evening meal together, why is this night different from all other nights? If the Council of Bishops meet regularly, when they receive our report, why is that report and that work different from all other reports and all other nights? When the special session of General Conference gets together in a similar format that makes everything feel and look so similar, why is that work different from all other work? Until we get a hold of that, we will only treat this work as if it's the same old stuff. So we need to walk into it a little bit. On the first level, this is a different kind of a work because it comes from a different kind of a group. This is not a group that comes to either the Council of Bishops with a report or with the proposal that goes on to the special session. This is not the work of a group that is trying to advance its own agenda. This is the work of a group whose only agenda is the agenda that the General Church has given to it through the Council of Bishops. And we've worked hard to make sure that our scope of work does not extend beyond that. And that this is a unique group. 32 people, boiled down from millions. Because of the way that you can represent and the skills and the capacities that you bring, from 9 nations representing all jurisdictions out of 15 states, men and women, straight and gay, laity, elders, deacons, bishop, a full span of generations, thanks to Casey Orr, who during Well, during her pregnancy, she decided to bring her baby along. This is a fully intergenerational group, more so than most other United Methodist meetings. And importantly, people were chosen so that all theologies and all of the positions that the church is wrestling with would come to the table, or that we would have people who would know how to listen to those voices out there. How are we doing? This making sense so far? This is a different kind of a group. One of you said that this is the most diverse group you have ever sat with. Bishop Torrio once made a comment that this group reminds him of the 1991 World Table Tennis Championship in Japan. Now, how many of others could say that? All right. What we have here is Jung Junhua and Ri Boon-hee, who were the two people who made up the championship team that brought the gold home. Hyun was from South Korea, Ri from North Korea. The nations did not decide to put together a unified team until 1 month before the contest. They represented the differences of all of the national issues that two people could face into, and even more than that, as some of you. They knew each other first as rivals, as competitors, as someone to be contested with and defeated. Within a month's time, they were able to address their issues so that they could be a team. This is a different kind of a group. This is very different in terms of what it produces. I'm still arguing about what's different about this work. It does not come from a like-minded group. Most of the work that goes to the Council of Bishop or to most of our committees or caucuses or any other group comes from a group of people who already have agreement before they begin to work together. This does not come from a like-minded group. It is not the product of debate and parliamentary procedure. We did not follow that as a way of being with one another while we were here. This is work that people need to understand did anger and upset each of us at some time. But nobody really ever left the table or stopped contributing. It is a product of conversation. And conversation is a path of discernment. It is a product of study, of prayer. We've been very clear that devotions and times of prayer and Bible are in fact the work, not the introduction to the work. It is the product of listening. We've been working really hard at each other so that we do not start by talking to one another as much as start by trying to listen to one another, and transparency and trust. In 26 days of meeting, this group has not taken anything to a vote. We have moved ahead by consensus on agreement on taking the next step. That has not been happy for us in many ways, but it was a way for us to be community. Yeah, we used a number of different ways of measuring whether we were ready to move ahead. But we never asked each other whether we agreed. We only asked, how can we work together for the next step? Significant difference. So it's been a different kind of work. Now, what I want to say is that if this is a different kind of work, what it's not, it has not been problem solving. The normative response for leaders, and the way we've been trained, is to be problem solvers. You format whatever the issue is as a problem, then you go after the solution. We know how to do that. That is the most comfortable way in which we can work. And if you think about the number of the issues that the general church has looked at, that's how we've done it. We had a concern about our congregations, particularly in the United States. The loss of membership, the weakening of our congregations, the number of congregations that were closing. We framed it as a problem, and then we said, what do we know about that problem? What does the literature say about that problem? Then what does research say as good ways to move ahead? And how do we break that down into variables? And how do we make those variables some of the processes and procedures that we're going to follow, and how can we get people to align themselves with that. Do you remember all that work around vital congregations? And it was an effort to try to problem solve and reverse a trend, and it had some traction. We know how to do that. In the global church, we have some of the same issues. We have resources in some places of the globe and growth in other places of the globe, and we're trying to figure out how do we do that? How do we bring them together in an equitable way for mission? And how do we recognize ourselves fully as brothers and sisters in Christ without being colonial, without being paternalistic, and recognizing that the mission is something that we all share together. That conversation is still going on, but it's a problem-solving conversation by saying, what's the issue here and what are the solutions? How are we doing? Is that making sense? What I'm after here is that the temptation of the church is to take a look at the third issue, the place of homosexuals in the church, and format it in the same way. And to say somehow we have to solve this problem. And that's where the Commission on a Way Forward took a very different turn. I want to suggest that there is no solution. The United Methodist Church, in particular, now I've worked with Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish systems across the United States and Canada and other places. And one of the things that is somewhat unique is our size as United Methodist and our global identity. Very few other communions in faith have that same kind of context. But part of what that means is that we have congregations in every red and blue state. Now what that means is every red and blue state is every state that has kind of a leaning toward a Democratic response or a Republican response. We have congregations in over 95% of the counties in the United States. Now, as much as we would like the Christian faith to influence the values of people where they live, the reality is where people live influences the values that they bring to the church. And so we are trying to get a denomination into a conversation where in the United States alone, there are a multiplicity of positions and answers and solutions. If you extend into our global community, now we're talking about African nations where homosexuality is actually illegal. And to take some steps there might even jeopardize the existence and the future of the United Methodist Church itself. And at the same time, if you go to the Philippines, Congresswoman Geraldine Roman was recently elected, who is transgender. A complete shift. If you go to Western Europe, the conversation is increasingly different and not at all as much of a crisis. And then globally, if you bring it down into a different generation, into our youngest generations, it's not an issue at all. Now, I'm not trying to suggest that there's any positions up there that are right or wrong. All I'm trying to point out is that the reality of the way in which we are having this conversation and the context in which we have this conversation tells us immediately that there are no real solutions. What I have argued with the Council of Bishops is that there is no definitive answer to this situation except for those people who have their own definitive answer. Now think about that. Do we not all have some conviction about this? And this conviction not only is based on where we're from, but it's based on how we have been formed, both as a person and in faith. Of course we have this multiplicity. So if we really want to insist that this is a problem to be solved, then it has no solution other than picking which side you want to be on. Now let's take a little bit of a side trip here into a bit of leadership theory that a lot of you are very familiar with, and this comes from Ron Heifetz. The difference he makes between technical work and adaptive work. Heifetz wrote a book, Leadership Without Easy Answers, in the mid-1990s, and it has probably been the formative text that has reshaped the way that leadership has been thought about across all of our organizations and institutions and governance and military and so forth. And he differentiates between technical work, which is the application of known solutions to known problems. Now, he's a physician as well as teaching at Harvard Business School, and the example that he would use is a broken bone. A broken bone is a very clear problem. You know when you have it. And the doctor has a very clear solution and knows exactly what to do with your broken bone. So what you do is you take your problem to the solution, you apply the known solution, and in a few weeks you're back up and running and everything's fine. But then he goes on to say that by definition, if something does not have a solution, it can no longer be a problem. And you can't do technical work, now you have to do adaptive work. Now, something that does not have a solution, type 2 diabetes, chronic asthma, terminal cancer. By definition, these do not have a solution because they cannot be cured. You can't simply reverse them. And so what you have to do is take a very different approach. They can no longer be seen as a problem. You cannot solve them. They are now a condition. And when you are faced with a condition, you have to learn how now to live in that situation. If you have chronic asthma, you're not going to change it. You have to learn how to live with it. Your doctor has to learn how to help you with treatment. You have to learn about your insurance. The family has to learn about your lifestyle. There's all kinds of learning that has to happen in a condition. And friends, a lot of what we have been doing here in our conversation is realizing that if you can't solve the problem, we have to learn how to then move ahead as a church. And that's why we have opened up this conversation for ourselves and hopefully for the larger church about a convicted humility. That in our convictions, we also have to be humble enough to realize that people are formed in different ways and come up with different understandings, and we're going to have to find a way to move ahead. And there'll be other ways in which the delegates, I hope, will be able to get a hold of that. So, if not a problem, in other words, I'm arguing here that if you can't solve it, then the other response in learning our way ahead is to make reasonable choices. And so that's where we're going to go. What are the choices that the Commission on the Way Forward has been faced with, and what are the choices that the delegates of special session are going to be faced with? And if you're going to make choices, you have to be able to make choices based on some guidance. What will guide you in making your choices? Well, the mandate that we received, we being the Commission on the Way Forward, the mandate that was given to the Commission from the Council of Bishops is a document that has been online. It's been in our publications. It is part of what has been central to our conversation and our work all along. And in that mandate, the mission, vision, and scope of the Commission are three primary ideas that in order to move ahead, we've been asked to find a way that can be as connected and unified as possible, that can be as agile, responsive, and contextual as possible, and that can live in and address the widest global and cultural mission field as possible. As a commission, are you not tired of hearing that? Because we have used it as our anchor for so long and as the point of measurement about whether we're moving in the right direction. And where I want to go here is to say not only why is it so important, but also why is it almost impossible to do? It will require some choices. We're not going to spend time on this except to say that in part of the conversation that our commission has had with the Council of Bishops, especially with the President, Bruce O., is that our work is really not just trying to resolve wherever we are around an issue, but we are at a point in the church that we have to find a new story, a better story to live. This is one of the tasks of leadership, to always give the people a better story to live than they already have. And in the United Methodist Church, we are now searching for a better story as a people. And that is not the work of the commission. That is the work of the Council of Bishops and eventually the work of the General Conference. But what this raises is whether or not a component of that better story is to be a people that have learned as to be a global church that is as connected and unified, is as agile, responsive, and contextual, and is able to address the larger part of the world in which we live. So when we do that kind of choosing, I suggested it's really hard to be able to do that. And that's because there is no clear decision that can be made. Choices have to be made instead. And in order to understand that, I want to talk about polarities. We've talked about this a little bit in the past. A definition of a polarity is two equal truths that cannot easily be held together at the same time. Two equal truths. One is not better than the other. One is not correct while the other is false. They are equal truths. The only thing you can't do is easily hold them together at the same time. Culturally, especially in the United Methodist Church, but the literature is talking about this in a much more global way, beyond the experience that we know here with our own institutions. One of the polarities that almost all organizations and certainly all institutions are dealing with is whether they should be centralized or whether they should be decentralized. Listen to the truths. If you are a centralized organization, you will be very orderly. Authority will be very clear. It will be at the top or the center, depending upon how you think about your organization. There will be a clear chain of command. Everybody will know their place. Everybody will be aligned to make sure that we are all working together. Does that not sound like a good thing to do? That is a truth that it helps for a very effective organization. But we're in a rapidly changing culture. And so wouldn't it be good to be decentralized? Because if you're decentralized, you can be very agile, you can change rapidly, you can be very contextual, you can move all of your decisions down to the people who are actually engaged with the work at the mission field. Is that not a good thing to do? It is. Each of them are equal truths in terms of a healthy, viable organization. Can you be centralized and decentralized at the same time? You can't. And that's where the dilemma comes in. If you put it on a polarity map, you can see that there are positives and negatives on both sides. On the centralized side, a centralized organization is orderly, it has clear communications, it has a division of labor, everybody knows what they're doing, it works well. But what we know is that if you stay centralized for too long, and if you live too close to that pole, you begin to slip down, and you become rigid, you become siloed, you become very difficult to change. Organizations that experience this immediately want to go over to this side and correct themselves and become agile, responsive, and creative, which is great. But if you stay over on this side too close or for too long, you slip down and you become chaotic, confusing, and disjointed. How are we doing? Does this make sense? It's a basic movement. And one of the things you'll look at in terms of histories of organizations is that history of organizations, history of governments, history of the military, it will always swing back and forth between these two poles. And so one of the things about understanding two equal truths is that it's not an issue of choosing which is right as if there was a solution to the problem. It's a question of which way should we lean now. It is a choice, not a solution. Okay. Let me say that theologically in the church, we have had those polarities forever. Do we live by law or do we live by grace? Yes. In your own personal life, in your own formation, where you are right now, discipleship means asking the question, which way do you need to lean to bring yourself into balance with the gospel. Faith and works, which is right. Read the Epistle of James, because that's where the argument started about both and which do you have to lean into. This is who we are, and we need to acknowledge that we are not a people that have a solution to every question that ever came before us. Okay, all of that is to say, why is it so hard to do what we're trying to do? Why can we not be unified and contextual at the same time? And the reason for that is that held in both of those are two equal truths that cannot easily be held together at the same time. Unity is an expression of sameness. Contextuality is an expression of difference. If we are all part of the same body of Christ, should there not be that in which we are the same? Absolutely, that's it. If we are missional people of the gospel in different places in the world, should we not be contextually different? Absolutely. Can we be the same and different at the same time? No. It's not something we can solve, but it is something we have to choose. What is right now? If we are same, and if we really want to push toward unity, then a lot of the conversation has to do with having a shared belief and a shared practice, that we have to be in agreement. There has to be clarity. If we want to allow differences and be contextual, then we have to share not belief and practice, but we have to share identity and purpose, and then give ourselves freedom to be more inclusive and to be more responsive. Friends, do not miss is if we go to one or the other pole for too long or too far, we slip and we become exclusive and rigid. Or we become with no clarity, no boundaries, and perhaps not even an identity. This is not a time in the life of the church to solve our problem. This is a time in the life of our church to choose who we need to be as we move forward. A very different issue. So, some of the questions that we have to face into. Which side of the polarity must the United Methodist Church now lean into in order to live into its next guiding story? One of the things about the work that we've done around models is that we have produced models for the Council of Bishops to consider that are in different positions, different places along the continuum between unity and contextuality. And so by looking at those models, we are in fact picking which of the values we want to lean into the most. That will eventually be the work of the delegates in the special session of General Conference. Let me offer a second question. Which mission must the church now choose to pursue? Another way of asking that is, who are you choosing for? This is a discomforting conversation because we are a long-standing, well-established institution. This comes from the work of Robert Quinn and his book on deep change and looking at an institution in a particular way. And one of the things that he says is that over a period of time, any long-established organization, again, this is not about the church. You can have this conversation about government, about military, about corporations, about any other institution. Any organization over a long period of time develops both a public mission and a private mission. A public mission is what the organization tells the world that it does. Now, I think it's helpful to take a look first at education, which is the example that Quinn uses, that in education, the public mission is to say that they educate children. But the private mission is to satisfy the strongest of the constituent voices within the organization. So in other words, if you think about it, is over time, all organizations move from the public mission, which is the external mission in the world, to a private mission of satisfying the voices that are already within it. And the private mission in education is satisfying who? The teachers, the parents, the board, community organizations, government, and at its worst, guess who doesn't make the list? Children. All organizations come to a point where if they are not guided, the public mission stands in contrast to what they actually do. And so that's part of what we need to wrestle with within the United Methodist Church ourselves at a time like this. Who are we trying to make our choices for? The public mission or the strongest of the constituent voices? Because the strongest of the constituent voices within any denomination are the clergy, the congregations, the members, the boards, the agencies, the caucuses. Who is it that we're trying to satisfy with the work that we're doing? So let's take a little bit of a digression here. Another guiding question: who is our client? For about 12 years, I was a senior consultant and director of consulting for Alban Institute. And as I was mentioning, did a lot of work across any number of our denominations. And somewhere around 2000, 2001, I had a contract with the ELCA, the Evangelical Lutheran denomination, and they wanted to talk about their candidacy program. Their concern was the quality of the candidates that were being brought before them for ordination and certification to move into role of pastor in their churches. Now, you may have heard rumblings of that conversation in the United Methodist Church. So we walked through a couple of stages of the work. The first was, let's go to the data. What does the data tell us? So they took a look at the whole group of their candidates, and after a little bit of factoring out, they separated out into 3 categories which were of almost equal size. The first group were those people who came right out of college, right through seminary, and then went right on for ordination and to be put into local churches. And they fundamentally found that to be a really promising group. Young people with a lot of purpose, a lot of energy. They were ready to put themselves to it. The second group were that group of people who were second career people. Not as young, not as much energy, but lots of potential and a lot of life experience that they could bring to it. And so that was also a really viable subgroup within their candidates. And then they came to the third group, which they described as damaged people. In other words, these were the people who were coming to the church, not because the church needed them, but because they needed the church. These weren't people who were coming to provide leadership. These were people coming looking for care. Well, okay. Again, that's a pattern that is true for the Episcopal Church, for the, for the Baptist Church, for the United Methodist Church. And so we move to the next part of the conversation, and that is to say, if that is what the data says, then which of these 3 groups do you spend most of your time with, give most of your attention, and direct most of your resources to? Anybody want to take a guess? The damaged people. And so they brought them back for the second interview the next year and the third interview. And in between they suggested, well, you ought to take a course here, or you ought to try that, or you ought to be working with these mentors, or perhaps even therapy. And here's 3 other people who are going to walk with you on this path. And oh, by the way, we're going to pay for that in order to help you. Do you hear what's happening? The church was bending in their direction, trying to get them to the most basic level where there might be even some possible hope that they could provide leadership. So that led to the third part of the consultation: why would you do this? And they wrestled with that question a lot. Well, part of it has to do with the pastoral heart. If you see someone who needs to be cared for, what do you want to do? You want to care. But the question wasn't, does that person need care? The question is, who is the client of the work you're trying to do as a group that is concerned with candidates for leadership of ministry? The client is actually the congregation out there. or even more specifically, the mission field around that congregation, for which the congregation needs leadership to help it reframe its purpose and to move the gospel into action. Your client is out there. Then why are you spending so much time here? What they finally came down to is they said, because the candidate is in the room and the client is not. Do you hear it? All right. So part of the choice that you as a commission have been wrestling with and the delegates have to continue to wrestle with is, who is the client of the choosing that you're going to do? Is it the constituencies that you already know all about and who are feeling the pain of the decision that the church is trying to face into? You all know who you have faces for these people. You and I are some of these people. Is that the client of our choosing? Or is the client the congregation out there and the mission field that the client is trying to serve? Are we trying to address the pain that we already see within the church, or the possibility that the church has in the larger mission field? Are we looking at the past, thinking about where this conversation has come from? Are we looking at the present and the constituencies that people have broken into? Or are we trying to make choices based on the future? Is this about the people of the institution, or is it about the people of the mission field? All right. So let's talk for a moment about why this work is so hard to do. Some of you know Malcolm Gladwell by his work, a journalist. He has a wonderful podcast. This is a very thoughtful man who does his homework before he does his descriptive work. And in one of his books on the outlier, he's trying to raise the whole issue or the question about, how do we understand people who are natural leaders? You know, there are some folk who just seem to have it all together. They know how to do it. And he said that, in fact, there are a couple of those people. But for the most part, every time you're looking at that kind of natural leadership, what you're looking at is someone who has spent enough time, has disciplined themselves enough, and has had enough experience to make it look easy. And he said that the research has suggested there's even a time frame on that people, if they spend 10,000 hours, are proficient and they make it look easy. When the Beatles hit the Ed Sullivan Show in the mid-'60s, and everybody thought this was the greatest thing that they had ever seen, and this was a singing group that could do everything, what they didn't know is that this group had spent 10,000 hours in the dives of Liverpool under every miserable circumstance, learning how to be a group that could do anything no matter what happened to them. But it looked easy. We okay so far? You, as a commission on the way forward, the Council of Bishops, as a group of people who have been called out in a special way, and the delegates of the special session to General Conference, is one of the most credentialed, experienced groups of leaders in the United Methodist Church. You have spent your 10,000 hours to know more about the church than anyone will ever ask you about. And you make it look easy. Have you not spoken to someone that when you raise a question, they just tell you what the paragraph in discipline is? That is too much information. But it means that you are practiced and experienced. What I want to suggest is that's why part of this work has been so hard for us, and why it's going to be so hard for the delegates in the special session. Will you consider that you know too much about the history of the church? Will you consider that you know too much about the Book of Discipline? Will you consider that you know too much about the competing constituencies that are part of this conversation, and you know so much that it is hard to bring it down to what the essentials actually are? Have you ever played Pictionary? Now, for you who may not know, that this is simply a game. You know, there's a word that is usually a noun that is taken, always a noun that's taken out of the dictionary, and you have a team of people, and someone on your team has to draw the picture and nobody else knows what the word is, and everybody else has to guess what that picture is within 60 seconds. We okay? Last time I played this, there was an engineer, on my team. And the word he drew was desk. Now here's a man who is disciplined in a whole world of objects, and disciplined in knowing how to represent all those objects, both for construction or repair or any other reason. He knew too much. We had 60 seconds, and we watched him think about what makes a desk. And then we watched him think about how do you represent a desk. And then after a little while, we watched his hands start to move, but never toward the paper, because he was still taking everything that he knew into a desk, and the pen never hit the paper until 55 seconds later. And this is as much as we got. And we lost. All right. Friends, can the special session, can the delegates get out from everything that they know? Get out from all that they have known and done in other general conferences in order to make new bags for new wine? We've been struggling with that, and so will they. So, last shot here, friends. There may be a bigger issue going on, a scheme of grander things. Phyllis Tickle in 2008 wrote a book called The Great Emergence, How Christianity is Changing and Why. She developed the Department of Religion in Publishers Weekly. The reason I raise that is because she was not writing this from a theological perspective or a denominational perspective. If you will, she had no dog in this fight at all. She was describing something that she saw. And in part of that, she said, about every 500 years, the empowered structures of institutional Christianity, whatever they may be at that time, become an intolerable carapace that must be shattered in order that renewal and new growth may occur. Now, she said that in another way in the book, and that is that every 500 years, the church has to go up into the attic and find out everything that is no longer helpful and get rid of it in order to make a way for the new. There are times we have to rethink ourselves. Let's go back. In the first century, there was a Council of Jerusalem. A council, not different from the kind of work that we were doing, taking a look at the different positions that people had, and they had to decide whether or not Christianity was going to be an ethnic expression of the Jewish faith, or whether the love and the grace of God was given to all people, including the Gentiles. Was it going to be local or was it going to be global? We would not be here if a decision went a different way. 500 years later, we had the fall of Rome and the teachings of the early church fathers, where the church had to say, now that we no longer fit within the political structure, what does it mean to be a church, and what does it mean to be a pastor? What is the pastoral role if we are no longer doing what the state teaches? We had to reform and reframe again. 500 years later, we were at the great schism in the 11th century, where the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox Catholic Church went different ways because of the understandings of the people. Only 500 years later to be met by the Great Reformation. And the whole question of what is the role of the church and what is the role of the priesthood to mediate the relationship between the people and God. Is it by faith or is it by works? And we're back to our polarity again. It is now 500 years later. Not to put too much weight on this. But what that does do, friends, is ask us whether or not what part of the work that we are doing is in fact choosing values that will direct the way the church lives into this next age. And as I said, the models that we have been working with are in fact different stops along the way between whether we're unified or whether we're contextual, but there are other values in there that we are expressing as well. The one church plan in the middle is the one that is being recommended by the Council of Bishops. It is, if you will, following the impulse of unity. It is asking everybody to be part of a global identity. It is asking people to give one another freedom of contextuality. It is, if you will, a decentralized system in which decision, mission, strategy is pushed out to where the leaders and where the people engage in the mission field. There are different impulses in the other plans. In the traditional plan, the impulse is really one about accountability. The identity is not so much global as much as regional. And let me say a word about that because that's an interpretation. One of the things that we do know in terms of the United States, and this is a United States kind of driven kind of observation, is that the differences around human sexuality are in fact regional. The coast, for the most part, not exclusively, the coasts see it different from the midland. The northern part sees it differently from the southern part. The expressions in the church follow some of those basic regional differences. And so one of the things about the traditionalist plan is that it invites people into more of those regional identities and invites the larger global church to choose along with which region you're going to respond to. And it is one that is following issues of uniformity, not contextuality. And it is a very centralized system. Everyone is under the same requirements, under the same rules, under the same agreements, under the same covenant. It's different from the one church plan. The connectional conference plan is different again. It's a value following the impulse of differentiation in space. Yes, we want to be unified, but we want to give everybody enough space so that they can live comfortably beside each other. And it also has a regional identity because those differences reflect some of those same regions. And the global church is invited, if they want, to come in to choose around some of those regional identities. And it follows contextuality. And I would suggest it's probably neither centralized or decentralized, but it is multiply structured. Question at a formative moment, not just in the church, but in the history of Christianity, is how are we best shaped to be a people to move ahead? There are large questions. The mission of the United Methodist Church is making of disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. And as we do that, as we move into the future, who will we be as a people trying to do that? In what form of faith community? With what unity? Seeking to do ministry with whom? Friends, your work is hard because these are not things to be solved. These are choices to be made. And the work that you have done allows the Council of Bishops, allows the delegates of special session to move into the choosing as they must as well. Thank you.
Thank you.